But yeah. Oh, I see we're top of the hour.
By this point, I know we would have this in hand, but 2022, hopefully brighter days all around, including online. Welcome everybody to week 2 of the Ostrom Workshops Colloquium series. We're going to be featuring Professor Todd Haugh from the Kelley School of Business today, which is going to be fantastic. And remember, just a couple of announcements looking ahead. This Wednesday, we have our kickoff for our research series. So this is always a lot of fun because it's going to be our research summaries roundtable featuring all the fantastic work that the Ostrom Fellows and research awardees are doing. So I'd encourage you guys to join that series of lightning round talks. And then we'll be following up with a presentation from our very own Professor Gustavo Torrens next Monday for the colloquium. A few other just quick announcements. As you probably saw on the listservs, but we'd appreciate your help in getting the word out. We are advertising a permanent Commons Program Director position. As you all know, INS has been doing an absolutely fantastic job filling that role right now on an interim basis. But we are looking for a permanent director as well. So we'd encourage anybody interested, reach out with questions, help us spread the word, apply. It's a really fun and unique opportunity to lead our Commons program looking ahead to next fall. We also are going to be doing some other experimentation in the research series here soon, including continuing the Ostrom Book Club. So if you have nominations for the Ostrom Book Club, let us know. We're going to be featuring a new book about Lynn and Vincent from our own affiliate, Eric Nordman, coming up here in a couple of weeks, as well as several recent edited volumes that have come out related to the workshop. So that's going to be a lot of fun. So let us know if you have any questions or nominations along those lines as well. And we will also finally be highlighting some work from our various working groups, including the polycentricity group, data, of course, and the space governance group. Some fun news there you might have seen last week with our new grant from the Carnegie Endowment. So great chance to get involved in any of those efforts if you are so inclined. So that's it for me. Angie, I'm going to turn the reins over to you to properly introduce our distinguished speaker for today. And thanks again for joining, everybody.
Hello, everyone. I'm Angie Raymond. I'm the Director of Data Management Information Governance at the Ostrom Workshop, for those of you I haven't met. And today, Scott and I's colleague, amongst others on this call today, Todd Haugh, is joining us. Todd is an Associate Professor of Business Law and Ethics and the Weimer Faculty Fellow in Business Law at the Kelley School of Business. He teaches and writes on white-collar crime, federal sentencing, business and behavioral ethics. He is a graduate of the University of Illinois. Gosh, do we play them this year? And Brown University, but he was also a Supreme Court fellow, a federal law clerk, and a white-collar crime defense attorney. He's speaking to us today on leading a healthier company, advancing a public health model of ethics and compliance. And I will lead this off by saying I very much enjoyed your paper, Todd. So thank you very much for sharing it with us. And I look forward to an engaging conversation. I'm your moderator, so if you have questions, you're welcome to write them in the chat, and I'll keep track of them as we go along. And otherwise, Todd's going to speak for 20-ish minutes, and then we're going to have a robust discussion amongst those of us on the call. So Todd, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Angie. Thanks, Scott. Let me share my screen here and get this started. Does that look okay? Okay, great, thanks. Well, so first of all, of course, so let me move your pictures around. There we go. Now I got you up on top where you should be. So thanks so much for giving me an opportunity to talk. Sorry, I'll just reorganize some screens here while I do this. Really happy to be presenting here, obviously as part of this colloquium series. I always feel sort of like slightly like a fish out of water when I talk to the Ostrom folks, because my area is, primarily behavioral ethics and corporate compliance. So that doesn't always seem to fit perfectly into this, sort of Ostrom structure. That said, if we think maybe about organizational compliance as kind of an important aspect of governance more generally, maybe then that will fit into the workshop focus. So, but I guess you all will be the judge of that, and then we'll see how we do. So I should also just mention that this paper has been accepted for publication, but I'm in the midst of edits right now. So perfect time to incorporate any comments or insights or feedback. So I'm be grateful for all of those. Okay, so I wonder how many of you have heard of the Apgar score or Virginia Apgar. So Virginia Apgar is, in my estimation, a pretty incredible person. Partly that's because she revolutionized the field of obstetrics and almost solely created the field of neonatology. And so this was in the 1950s and 60s, all at a time when there were few female doctors. And by the way, just for interesting historical fact, she was denied a position as an obstetrician because her colleagues didn't think she'd be able to build a successful practice. And then she went on essentially to revolutionize her whole field, the field she had been sort of pushed out of in some ways, by creating what is known as the Apgar score. So if you don't have kids, you might not be aware of the Apgar score, but what it does is essentially assigns a value to 5 different categories that indicate a new born baby's health. And the score's genius, I think, is it takes something that's basically subjective and hard to quantify, the health of a very newborn baby, and it quantifies that, which is important. But even more so than that, it systematizes a set of behaviors. So once you have the score, right, everyone in that delivery room, the doctors, the nurses, everyone else, essentially assesses the baby's health through the same criteria, which then leads to particular action on behalf of those healthcare providers. And it also creates better overall health outcomes. Okay, certainly for the individual baby, but also when you aggregate those scores and look at them and consider interventions for the public as a whole. Now, I didn't know much about the Apgar score until my second daughter was born. She's the very, very little tiny one there in the picture. She was 2 months premature. And so you realize in that type of situation, just how critical something like this is, because it tells the doctors and nurses right away that more intervention is needed. And again, if we aggregate that data, it creates a way to consider those interventions on a much larger sort of public health scale. So I see this type of thing as one of the best types of public health innovations, right? It's data-driven, it's behaviorally cognizant, and it's focused on risk, essentially, and how we can mitigate that risk. And that's exactly the approach that I think corporate and organizational compliance should be taking in the future. It's another area where you're taking something basically subjective, right, ethical decision-making, and trying to create this systematized pro-social sets of behavior that ultimately are going to act for the larger good. And so that leads me to kind of the simple thesis of this paper, which is basically this, right? Corporate leaders should draw from the successful lessons. And I say successful, I know there's lots of critique right now about how well public health is doing, but drawing from the successful lessons of public health to promote ethical behavior within the firm. And so the way that I get there in the paper is essentially through 3 steps. I talk about the evolution of compliance, right? How it's evolved from a more towards a more behavioral approach. I also draw on behavioral ethics theory to connect public health and compliance, primarily doing that through network analysis and this behavioral contagions idea in particular, which is essentially shared between the 2 fields of compliance and public health. And then I apply that theory to explore how leaders could take this approach in their own companies and hopefully make their companies healthier legally, ethically, and maybe financially too. Now, I'm not going to march through the 3 steps. I know that this group, lots of people in this group have read the paper. So what I thought I would do is just highlight a couple things of interest along those steps, and then we can address or pick up whatever issues are going to be outstanding in the Q&A. Okay, so there are a lot of ways to consider the evolution of compliance. I have looked at this, I think, from a few different standpoints. So one of those is a temporal standpoint. So every decade, basically, of corporate scandal, there tends to be a legislative response, right? So you have a corporate scandal, you have a legislative response. which then drives compliance within organization, and it essentially embeds it deeper and deeper within companies. What happens there is we've essentially had kind of long periods, if you will, of instances where companies have just been very reactive to legislative responses and then the regulatory ones that come after it. And so it's created, at least in the early part of compliance, sort of a check the box mentality, right? Basically, compliance is very legalistic because compliance is acting almost as like an insurance policy against corporate liability. Corporations are trying to make sure that they're not on the hook for the acts of their employees. So what they do is they institute compliance, but they only institute it up to a level that keeps that liability at bay. Okay, so that's one of the big problems along this evolutionary landscape. Other folks have looked or focused on how compliance has progressed as a profession. So compliance started out as basically an arm of legal, organized under the general counsel's office. As you might imagine, that makes it very lawyer dominated and rules oriented. Okay, that's what lawyers like to do. And then it's kind of evolved from there. But regardless of what lens you take, essentially there's been a move from compliance as it's matured, both, and I say mature both conceptually and professionally, I think, towards a more data-focused kind of risk-based approach. This becomes very clear in 2019 when the Department of Justice publishes something called the Evaluation of Corporate Compliance Programs. And this is a document that is essentially 100 questions that prosecutors are asked to ask companies or ask themselves as they're interviewing companies to determine whether the prosecutor is going to charge those companies with some type of criminal liability. This document or these questions basically get filtered into companies. And so I think it's now obvious that compliance is moving away from this command and control kind of check the box mentality. But it's still a little unclear as to what the ultimate end game is, because that evolution guidance document is essentially just a bunch of questions. And so there wasn't clear answers about exactly what companies should do. I think that is coming into more focus now, because many people in compliance are talking about what they're calling compliance 3.0 at this point, which is basically a recognition that behavioral change is going to be the metric by which you measure compliance effectiveness. So this approach, this kind of next evolution of compliance, has been trumpeted the most, I would say, by someone called Wei Chen. She is the Department of Justice's first compliance counsel. She actually drafted those questions that started this evaluation, and she has made very clear that the focus of compliance should be on behaviors and behavioral focused data, and creating a behavioral baseline, and then trying to reduce conduct risk that compared against that baseline. Essentially, kind of a public health model, if you will, although she doesn't say it always that explicitly. That's what regulators should be expecting, and I think we're seeing that change. And so to operationalize that, instead of compliance training on things like vague or abstract concepts like virtues or values, for example, compliance really, according to Wei Chen, has to be moved more into the workflow where we can see it actually impacting behavior, and then making sure we're using that behavioral change as the actual metric. Okay, this has led to innovations in compliance that seem to me to be very Apgar-esque. So this is a checklist, for example, that one compliance provider has started using. And this is around international travel. So if you're an employee who's going to take an international trip, you would see this checklist and sort of tick off all the things that you can do to essentially drive down compliance risk as you're traveling internationally. And this is a type of behavioral intervention, even though it seems like a fairly simple one that in theory can lead to big change. Okay, so if that's where compliance is heading along this evolution, or maybe it should be heading, I think a fair question is, how can public health, or how can this public health model aid in that? And I think it is a fair question to actually ask, right? Does public health really have that much to do with ethics and compliance? Okay, that should be a question, at least that would be in my mind if I were you hearing this presentation or reading the paper for the first time. I think the answer to that is yes. especially when you consider kind of this evolution over the past 20 years. What we're now seeing is behavioral science essentially being kind of the linchpin to both modern compliance and also modern public health. Now, public health has been doing this for a lot longer and on a wider scale, even if it hasn't always used the behavioral science terms when speaking of its types of interventions. So let me highlight one place where the two converge, and that's in the area of behavioral contagion. And so to explain that, I got to talk a little bit about something called the Framingham Heart Study. The Framingham Heart Study is a massive public health study that began in 1948. It's this longitudinal study of the causes of heart disease, and it took a community approach to recruiting its participants. That's what kind of makes it so interesting. So basically, almost everybody in Framingham, Massachusetts, was enrolled in the study. They got physicals on a regular basis, their blood drawn, all, questionnaires, public health type questionnaires, including they were asked about their social connections and friends and family. And so because the study has gone on so long, we now have 3 and almost 4 generations of participants. There have been all kinds of important public health findings that come out of this study because of the massive amount of data collected. So for example, this study is the one that confirmed essentially that obesity and physical inactivity increase the risk of heart disease, or that high blood pressure is linked to the increased risk of stroke. Okay, so these are kind of findings that we now take for granted, but this is what comes out of this Framingham study. What more interesting to me is when network researchers got into the data, they discovered how health behaviors, things like smoking and obesity and some other things, are influenced by social ties, right? That friends and family can spread health behaviors through social networks. So for example, researchers found that when a person becomes obese, the chances that a friend will become obese increases by almost 60%. It's not because, they're living necessarily in the same household or that they're, sort of like, sharing their groceries. It's that friends who live even hundreds of miles away can have just as much of an impact as friends who are next door, because it's about social norms and the influence of friends and family on your beliefs and behaviors. So this is called a complex contagion, and it's prevalent in all kinds of health behavior. And critically, complex contagions are also important to understand ethical decision-making and behavior as well. We see this through the work of someone called Mark Granovetter, who modeled mathematically rioting behavior and found that basically social ties between potential rioters caused flashes of illegal behavior that would not have been understood or could not have been understood except looking at this kind of social contagion aspect. Another behavioral ethics researcher working now, Francesca Gino from Harvard, has a series of studies that show that people act more unethically if they are psychologically close to others acting unethically as well. And so the same thing I submit to you is happening in ethical decision-making within companies where employees are linked in social and organizational networks. So really good example of this is the most recent Wells Fargo compliance failure. There you had 5,300 employees who were dismissed for sales integrity violations. And if you follow that, the sort of pattern, you can see how that unethical behavior sort of spread both when supervisors kind of brought this idea into certain branches and then across the branches and then even across regions as more and more people talked and understood what was going on, sort of a learned behavior aspect of unethical decision-making. Okay, so the upshot of all of this, I think, is that we can use the teachings of public health and public health as it's done well to do compliance better. And I lay this out in the paper, take a more scientific mindset to compliance, change how compliance outcomes can be assessed, right? More data focused, more behavioral focused, right? Actually measuring behavioral change. And we can even use more diagnostic tools like they do in public health or any kind of public health study, for example. We can test ethical decision-making through diagnostics, and then we can use that to inform how we monitor employee action, and then maybe even create interventions. In my last minute or two here, what I thought I would do is just give you kind of a sense of where I see this going. And I'm going to do that through talking about a project that I'm working on currently. So there's this really great data set that has all the email traffic, or not all the email traffic, a lot of email traffic, 106 million, 1.6 million emails sent and received by Enron management between 2000 and 2002. Enron, of course, being one of our more public and massive financial accounting scandals. And with a couple data science students, we took those emails and we mapped the network of these Enron emails. And so we can essentially see the nodes are the people, and the edges of those connections are all the different emails that they send back and forth. And we can identify the unethical nodes, right? The people that we know were either charged or committed unethical conduct. And we can look at the connections between these folks. And what we can see is that if you're connected to someone who acted unethically, you are also more likely to have acted unethically yourself. That's kind of expected, even though showing it graphically is pretty neat. And it's sort of an important insight for corporate compliance folks, because this is not really how they think of doing compliance. But what I'm really excited about is this idea of, well, what do you do? How do you intervene? And so our next step here is to use maybe natural language processing to look at the emails, to try to think about how can we actually do this without knowing who's unethical, right? To think about doing this proactively, but also modeling what happens when you pluck an unethical node out of the network, and we can actually see the overall risk or ethical risk of the network go down. So that's kind of where this type of thing, taking a public health model, ethical contagion model, I think can go. And that's pretty exciting from a corporate compliance standpoint. Okay, I'll stop there and be happy to take any questions.
So if you'll unshare your screen.
I think I did. Okay.
You did.
Great.
And so questions, I'm looking for hands or the chat box, either one. Otherwise, I have questions and I will dominate. Okay, I'll start off. Your thoughts on, I mean, this is sort of, your sort of prediction. What might be the risk? Let's say I discover an unethical node.
Yeah.
Right. We've seen these sort of contagions before in corporations. And what response is the corporation going to take? I guess. Yeah. And I know that's farther than what you're going to do, but I'm intrigued by, the network defects and what then, corporations might be able to do when they discover them. So, and I know it's probably the next step, but what do you foresee that potentially being?
Yeah. So let me answer it this way. The way how I think this type of model or this way of thinking about compliance can be used, and then maybe what the practicalities of that are going to be. Because I think you're asking about the practicalities, right, which are maybe not aligned with how I.
Right. I can't imagine, the boss coming in and firing the entire node without, some type of, I know we're mostly at will, but
yeah,
that's not going to end well.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
So one thing is, if organizations are able to actually use network science and map their networks, which isn't actually as difficult as you might think. You can do that basically with a survey and a little bit of data science knowledge that I don't have, but it's pretty easy on the market. I mean, there's lots of students that can do that, and we have them here at IU, for example. You can map your network and you see who's connected to whom. Okay, so one benefit of that is, if you have someone acting unethically and you know that, right? And companies would know that through their normal monitoring practices, right? Hotline tips, things like that, reports up to managers, their normal audit functions that they would already do in compliance. We can look at that and say, okay, if you have nominated a set of friends or people that you're connected to, there's something called the friendship paradox in network theory, which basically means that your nominated friends are likely to be more central to the network than you are, right? Sort of your friends have more friends than you do. Okay, that's kind of a truism on average for most people. And so what we would think is if we identify wrongdoing, we can now see where that wrongdoing is likely to spread, assuming these networks effects and this contagion holds in unethical behavior. And so we could actually do more monitoring, for example, of those friends of yours. So we could try in some ways to stop wrongful behavior before it kind of spirals out of control, before it gets to that 5,300 number like we saw in Wells Fargo. Okay, so that's one benefit. The other is, truly like plucking the node out and then watching, particularly if they're really well connected, right? Watching that risk drop. That's all good in theory, right? And that could be beneficial. So I think it's helpful for companies to even see that, because they start to see the real risk that unethical decision-making has in the organization. It's not just one single person doing a single thing bad, which is how most companies think about wrongdoing, okay? It's a connected aspect of unethical decision-making, and it can impact the entire organization much quicker than they think, particularly if the person who's doing wrong is well connected. Okay, so that's one thing. Now, your question though about, we're going to come in and fire the group because it's acting unethically, and it makes it even more difficult if you have a high achieving, well-connected person who has acted unethically. Okay, that is a managerial decision, that every company already makes, frankly. What my argument is, or idea is about compliance, is let's make it with all the data, and let's make it with a complete picture and show actually what the true risk is. Because I think what companies will realize, and particularly if regulators also ask these type of questions, they're going to realize that the harms are a lot greater than just one person doing a bad thing, that it's actually the contagion could potentially impact the company a lot more. And then that identifies the true costs. And that helps companies, I hope, make a better decision, which is either sanction, fire, or maybe isolate or demote somebody and take away some of their influence in an organization.
So you have a question in the chat, actually a couple, but would you like to you want me to read it to you? I can never.
No, I got it here. Well, I have two, so let's see here.
Wes has just popped up and Brian was in between those two.
Okay, hang on. So, sorry. Do you think behavioral intervention monitoring programs, whether through compliance workflows, can disincentivize risk-taking and decrease innovation? I think that's a great question. Listen, certainly the more controls you put in place, it has the potential impact to decrease risk-taking and decrease innovation. Yes. I think that's always a concern. I mean, I guess the way that I think about it is if you can try to work in behavioral science, cognizant controls, and I'm thinking primarily of nudging and things like that, although that's not going to do it all the way for compliance. But if you think about that way, it actually, for a lot of employees, I think they look at it as a positive, because they think about, hey, I want to be able to do my job in an innovative way that achieves the goals that I'm trying to have for myself and my company, but I want to do that in as a little invasive way as possible. I think that is one benefit of trying to work into compliance into the workflow process, as opposed to what's done now, which is essentially we do standardized training across the organization with very little understanding of what works and what doesn't. And so oftentimes you have all kinds of training that takes up a lot of time that actually doesn't impact behavior at all. So yeah, I suppose there is a risk of it hurting innovation, but I can't imagine that the risk is a whole lot more than what it is now, frankly.
Brian?
Good. And I read most of the paper, but didn't finish, so apologies if you've covered this. A bunch of this seems good, and I can see in terms of nudging and encouraging people. Does this address a situation where you have a group of people who, in a sense, either know they're doing wrong things or are so convinced of their way of, this is what we do at Boeing and so on. So whether you could talk through, whether it's Volkswagen or Wells Fargo, are there ways in which this would help with that kind of situation where, again, you have a group of people, including, management people, all of whom have kind of gotten themselves engaged in a whole pattern of things?
Yeah. Thanks for that question. I think it's a really important one. So any compliance intervention is unlikely to be able to stop the person that is absolutely intent on doing wrong, particularly for themselves. Okay, I mean, if an employee, particularly someone with a lot of ability to violate trust, right? So the higher you get up in the organization, if they are dead set on doing wrong and knowingly breaking a law or rule, so that it's pretty hard for the company to stop that. That doesn't actually, in some ways, companies are less concerned about that so long as they have some kind of real control, because it's easier to argue later on, hey, listen, we put in all kinds of controls. This person actively tried to thwart those. We can't be held liable for that, okay? But there are ways that you can have hard controls, sort of the standard mechanisms by which you would try to control that type of behavior. I think what behavioral ethics research has demonstrated over the past 15 or 20 years is the bigger worry is the kind of unknowing or unmeaning wrongdoer, in the sense that a person who doesn't see wrongdoing because they've rationalized away what's going on, and they sort of take these little, bites at unethical behavior, and then it spirals and creates kind of massive risk in the organization. I think that's the story of Wells Fargo at the lower level employee ranks. Now, the question is that the story at the higher supervisor ranks? Okay, so one thing that my way of looking at compliance might help is if you see, right, if you think about all these people as connected through a network, and you identify wrongdoing in one area, and we can see who they're connected with, it's likely we can, hopefully, or in theory, we can do some monitoring and some interventions that would stop that overall wrongdoing before it starts to spiral and spread too far. So you're essentially reducing risk because we're identifying wrongdoing and then we're finding where it might spread next. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. But I think it's an improvement over what we do now, which is essentially we just assume all wrongdoing is kind of sprinkled throughout the organization equally, and we just try to spot check it everywhere. And I think that is, I think this public health model helps in that regard.
So I've got a couple questions in the chat, so I'm going to read them because it just occurred to me that on the recording you won't see the chat. Can you talk more about the hypothesized mechanisms by which these behaviors spread through ties and networks?
Yeah.
Is it social signaling, power relations, complicity? Is it possible to test these in your future studies?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So I think it is partly it's social signaling. I think the way that I put these two things together is through rationalizations that come through social ties. So if you're considering, there's lots of theories about why people commit illegal or unethical acts. The ones that to me are the strongest, the theory that's the strongest is this idea of sort of crime as a learned behavior. This is Edwin Sutherland. This is Donald Cressy. And the idea is that we rationalize, we sort of hold two things in our concept in our mind at the same time. I'm a good employee, a good, husband, mother, father, whatever, while also doing the bad act. And a rationalization ties those two, allows those two things to move forward. I think what happens, that psychological closeness seems to help create a rationalization. This idea that someone else I'm close to is doing that thing therefore it's okay for me to do that thing as well. Sometimes I think that isn't entirely conscious when you talk to individuals. And the reason I have a sense of that is because in the studies of wrongdoing behavior, cheating behavior, the psychological closeness studies that I mentioned that Francesca Gino has done, they ask people afterwards, like, do you think your affiliation with the student who did wrong had anything to do with you? And people are like, no, not at all, right? They don't really even see that in their own thinking, even though it seems to have had an impact. So that's the way that's the mechanism I think why this is happening. How to test that, I don't have a perfect way to think how to test that exactly, if that's the perfect mechanism. I mean, I'll have to give that some thought, and I'd be happy to hear people's people's thoughts on that as well. I guess I mean, I don't want to be flippant about it, but I care less about exactly what the mechanism is that the mechanism is true. And I think that's pretty well supported. Although, I'm sure there's lots of holes to pick. So I don't have a perfect answer on the second half, but that is the theory under which I'd be working, kind of the rationalization theory.
I don't want to keep going to the chat naturally if there's someone on here that has a question. Otherwise, I can read from the chat as well.
I just raised my hand as well, Angie, but I can go whenever.
Go for it, Scott. And then that way I can go back and forth otherwise. So Scott.
No worries. Such an interesting paper, Todd. Thank you
Thanks,
so much
Scott,
for sharing it with us. No, I really appreciate it. I just had two quick things. One is just maybe a potential linkage. As you said, not everything has to relate to the workshop, that's for sure. But there are a couple of our active affiliates who are doing work related that could be interesting to brainstorm on a little bit more. And I'm thinking of one of our former directors, Mike McGinnis, is doing some really interesting work on polycentricity in the U.S. healthcare sector. And I think there could be some fun opportunities to explore, what you're discussing here in terms of kind of complexity theory based on what that really interdisciplinary group has found already here in the U.S., but they're also looking a bit internationally. So that could be fun. So happy to connect you. And similarly with Barbara Cherry over at the law school, since she's so involved with complex adaptive systems. So as you said, it doesn't take, a ton to get these models together, but, figuring out what to do next and finding the linkages and getting the methodologies down can be interesting. So happy to connect you, in other words, with those two folks, if that could be fun. And then my question is, I like the public health analogy, frankly, and I'm remembering, I'd use the public health analogy as well. I feel like maybe it gets overused a little bit, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, especially, given the pandemic and some of our failings during the pandemic in the real public health context. But I'm wondering if you could reflect a little bit on, where you feel like, pushing, because I run into this in cybersecurity all the time, right? All the ways analogies fall short. Where do you feel like, the public health analogy here, dealing with corporate compliance, where does it let off? You know what I mean? Like how far can you push it, before it just becomes, so tenuous that you feel like the value add just really starts to diminish. So I'm sure that's something you kind of wrestle with a little bit in the paper, and would love to hear your thoughts on it, because I similarly wrestle with the same thing.
Yeah, thanks, Scott, and thanks for those connections. I made a note of them here, so I'll try to look at their work and understand that a little bit better. I mean, so I think that's fair, and you're right. I mean, I started writing this at the beginning, in some ways, of the pandemic, right, where public health was obviously front and center, and it was very positive, I think, right in the very beginning. It's gotten beaten up since, and in fact, behavioral interventions in public health, I think in some ways, we're talking about nudges in particular, have gotten beaten up a little bit more. I mean, there's a critique about whether nudging has actually really worked, or at least worked to the extent that people had hoped it would. So that is a reality of this. I think what I tried to focus on is what I see as like the core of good public health interventions, which is, data-driven, behaviorally cognizant. And what I mean by that is sort of this ecological model of public health, which essentially says, public health is more than just individual health. we have to think about individual health as part of this larger system, and that's influenced by all kinds of different inputs, social, all kinds of things that are going on in your life and in the lives of people connected to you, environment as well, right? And so that is kind of more of a systems, I don't know if it's polycentric exactly, but that is I think a better way to look at public health. I think that's kind of the core of it. And then also that the interventions are mostly, I think, about decreasing risk, right? It's not as if you're going to get rid necessarily of a lot of these public health problems, things like, unhealthy lifestyle or anything like that. It's more of how do we create interventions that drive that risk down. So that was the core that I focused on. When you get too far afield of that, I think you're right. Maybe the analogy drops down. Maybe it doesn't hold. With ethics and compliance, frankly, I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, because I think it's been done poorly for quite a while, where there's not a whole lot of theory about what you should do and why. And a lot of the assumptions that are made, I think, are fairly faulty. And so that is, as part of this evolution, that's where I think we should be taking this, more thinking about behaviors, more thinking about data, and more thinking about how do we demonstrate that behavior has changed as a metric to effectiveness, as opposed to what now is the metric, which is basically how much training are we doing, which doesn't tell you a thing about whether it's actually working. So
I'm going to go to the chat really. Thank you for that, by the way. Ooh, thank you for that. Very much. I'm going to go to the chat. I'm going to summarize it because I do know it's difficult to read these longer things, the longer chat. So in general, Jamie, who's in the union, so she can't talk, so I'm going to unfairly summarize. Your paper seems to deal with the public aspects such as fraud, which is regulated by law. Do you also find private-facing issues, such as those dealing with violations of culture or internal norms?
Yeah. So the answer to that is yes. I see those two things as very tightly connected. The only difference is, well, not the only difference, but one of the main differences is that at least in this sphere, that a prosecutor regulator has decided to look at it. So, one of the real limitations when you look at trying to understand compliance is the public indicators of wrongdoing within organizations are only getting the super small tip of the iceberg, because it's really just where prosecutors and regulators focus is, and that's constrained by all kinds of things, including budgets, including administrations, right? Looking at certain things. Okay. So what we have seen, the very little data that there is, because companies, as you might imagine, don't want to give a lot of their compliance data out, right? Because that demonstrates that their employees are doing wrong. Eugene Soltz at Harvard has this a paper out a couple of years ago. It's I think one of the better ones that he actually got data and looked at hotline data and found, the instances of wrongdoing, ethical wrongdoing that would violate either a company law or a norm, but not so much that it was like an interpersonal norm, right? So he goes higher than that, not just interpersonal conflict between people, but an actual sort of violation of a company rule, showed 26 violations per month. I forget what it was, but the point is much higher than anybody would have seen from the public data. So yes, I do think about that. And in fact, that is where that's where compliance should be focused, because I tend to think about these things as, some of these internal violations are kind of the canary in the coal mine, right? For a really long time, for example, HR data has not been integrated into compliance, true compliance data. That seems to be like a miss for me, because that's where we see lots of things like harassment data. Okay, harassment data is unethical conduct and unethical decision-making. And that is an indicator of lots of other bad decision-making in an organization, and also poor probably internal controls if you have managers that aren't able to stop that, right? So if we take our networked idea again, you're likely to see the same people that are, being written up or investigated for harassment, also making other unethical decisions and also influencing the decisions of others. So I like the idea of looking at all of this as a data point. Now, how you weight those, that's going to be, I think that's an open question, but so I think the answer to your question, yes, private facing issues really important. And that's what companies should be doing, not waiting for regulators to tell them they violated the law.
Gustavo?
Hi. Well, to some extent, I think it's a kind of a follow-up from the previous question. So my first question, you just answered. So the second one is, I was thinking that maybe a good way of dividing these compliance situations is talking about situations in which there is something that violates the main goal of the organization versus something that is aligned with the main goal of the organization. For example, collusion. Collusion is something that is illegal, is bad. It could be one case of violation, but that's pretty much aligned with the goal of an organization of increasing profits. No, and that's the reason we prosecute those things. No, so I would consider those situations very different from an employee stealing from the company, which essentially the companies, they have all the incentive to try to fix those problems. So in some sense, would be that a good idea, kind of a starting point on, because at the end what we have to think is where do we put the power to audit these things, no? Yeah. And then from my perspective is one, you can handle it within the organization. The other one, almost by definition, requires some kind of power auditing outside the organization, and those are very different animals, no?
Yeah, I think so. So you're absolutely right. Kind of demarcating the conduct as sort of against or benefiting the corporation. That's what the criminal law in particular, when we talk about corporate entity liability, would do exactly that. So you're absolutely right. A corporation's only going to be liable for the criminal acts of its employees if it's in benefit of the corporation. So, stealing just to benefit yourself from the corporation is not going to get the company in trouble. And that's not going to drive a lot of compliance intervention, aside from the idea that companies just don't want their employees stealing from them, because that's not generally good. But that's usually a fairly, the numbers are big in the aggregate, but it's fairly small company to company. I guess, so I think you're absolutely right about that. And I think the law would recognize that. I tend to think about this as behavioral decision-making being kind of the central core, and then compliance being around that, and then governance being around that, and sort of risk management being around that. Anytime that I have an employee making an unethical decision, that to me is a problematic data point. Because if you can make an unethical decision in one domain, I think it's likely that you can rationalize to make an unethical decision in another domain. So that's something I'm concerned about. I think this, approach can take that into account. I'll just say one other thing. I mentioned diagnostics as being one potential tool that's obviously used a lot in health, public health. A colleague of mine here in the business law and ethics department, we're working on essentially an ethical a risk diagnostic for employees, and it does exactly what you're talking about, which is it asks employees, do you understand and can you identify essentially the values and norms of your organization, that its stated values, and then it tries to determine whether the values and norms and interests of the employee diverge from that of the company, and that we see as creating compliance risk. And then that would be a place where you might want to direct more monitoring and things like that. So we're thinking about that kind of along the same lines as you are. I don't know. I don't have a perfect answer about the outside versus inside audit. Internal audit, of course, is something that lots of companies do. If you're thinking about like auditing third parties, which does create compliance risk, that is really, really challenging, and companies are trying to figure that out now. I don't know that they've got a perfect handle on all that. What they tend to do is assume that there's going to be wrongdoing outside and force the ethical decision of their employee. That's how they kind of, you know, they make it go internal, because that's sort of the sphere that they can control the most, I think.
So I have questions, but the floor is open. Scott, I can't put your hand down. So do you have another question or?
Sorry about that. Always
Okay,
more questions.
I just don't want to skip you.
No.
I have another question, but you can go.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. Go. Yeah, we have 9 minutes. So ask a follow-up. That's perfect.
No, it's in a completely different direction. I was thinking that to some extent, in some organizations, there is kind of a proliferation of rules to be complied, you know, to the point that essentially, you know, sometimes I think members of the organization have the feeling that it's impossible to comply with everything.
Yeah.
So I think it would be also a good idea to start thinking about what areas should be prioritized and which areas is, well, there is a marginal cost of keep complying with things. And then, well, the risk is too low, live with the violations there, so essentially.
Yeah, absolutely, 100% agree with you. And in fact, I think it's really, I think it's pronounced in most large organizations, right? There are too many rules, too many, there's way too much training, that I am absolutely convinced of, because, and too much training, particularly if you think about it from a marginal cost perspective, because if you multiply the amount of hours of training by the average salary per hour of an employee, you see the real cost of this, and it's almost impossible to see the true benefit that comes of that. And in fact, most companies don't even try to measure it anyway. So they're essentially just spending a lot across the board without any real idea of behavioral intervention. So I think you're 100% right. I think that's consistent with what I'm arguing, which is public health kind of taking a risk-based approach. And so thinking about, right, what are our largest risks in the organization? Where should we focus our efforts in compliance? Yes, there's going to be training for sure. There's going to have to be some rules, no doubt, right? I'm not arguing that we're just like, we don't have any more rules and it's all behavioral focused. I think that would almost assume that that would assume that incentives don't matter, right? Which of course we know they do. So I think that is what companies should do, is take a risk-based approach. I guess what I'm advocating for is oftentimes companies don't even really realize, they have no idea about what they're doing if it actually works. And so the metric by which to actually understand that is change in behavior. The only way to understand change in behavior is to measure a baseline of the behavior that you're trying to change, and then have an intervention and measure again. We can think about more sophisticated ways to do that versus less, but that to me seems the better approach. And again, that's kind of more of a scientific kind of public health approach, as opposed to what's going on now, which is frankly just a lot of indiscriminate training.
Other questions? I have a couple of comments. If not, we're at about 5 minutes.
So I'm just taking notes here. That's why I'm looking down.
Yeah. So I have a comment, maybe as much as a question, but feel free to respond, obviously. For the frequent flyers on here, I'm going to bring up surveillance as deeply troubling and problematic, and even Todd knows that this is going to happen. So I definitely don't mean this, to be confrontational, but I do think the paper is embracing a surveillance aspect that oftentimes fails to recognize cultural norms and cultural behavior, as well as tends to end up leading to mission creep, where, hey, look, we were trying to, monitor this, and it turns out we gathered all this other data, and look what else we can figure out. And, that is going to bother me forever. You're not going to talk me out of it. It's totally not going to talk me out of it. There's tons of research on how marginalized communities get excluded and over surveilled because of this. The one thing, though, that I want to say is, this, and I don't see it in there. And so I want to be sure everyone on this, Todd knows this, but I don't see it in your paper.
Yeah.
That is the one thing I know this. So give us a footnote or something that says, hey, look, I want to be really careful. We're talking about surveillance for a particular purpose with an incredibly specific goal that is in no way going to, that has to be monitored as well. we can't just have the techies surveilling Facebook for our employees on randomness.
Yeah.
And you know this, but I didn't see it in there. So it's sort of a comment and a nudge. By the way, Brett Frischman is a frequent flyer at Ostrom, and he's one of the anti-nudgeites, if you like that connection as well. But you pick nudge if that's what you like. It's not so much about that. It is, I know you recognize what I've just said, and I didn't see it in there, or at least I didn't see it in there pronounced enough.
Yeah.
And you're going to get pushback on that because of it.
Yeah. And sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but I already have, and I think it's a fair criticism. Can I ask you, Angie? So, all right, so this is great back and forth, if you don't mind.
Oh, go for it.
So when I have talked about these ideas, and this comes up, frankly, in a couple of different areas. It comes up in diagnostics. People get uncomfortable with diagnostics, right? Because they say basically you're trying to you're creating a bad proxy for future wrongdoing. That's what a diagnostic is looking at, or this type of ethical diagnostic that I talk about. Okay, so some people are concerned about that, right? Some people are concerned about the technological just sort of monitoring, particularly when I talk about looking at emails. Okay, people get very concerned. Okay, and I know you'd probably be involved in that. And also then when you talk about like NLP and all the potential problems that come from those things. Okay.
Right.
So, but some people then say, I have other people that would say, hey, this is at-will employment. You're in a corporation, right? As long as we're sort of upfront that this is what's happening, like too bad, right? If you think that, that you don't want to be monitored for ethicality, then you should seek employment elsewhere, and that's fine. Okay. I don't know. Obviously, I think this idea of monitoring is important. I think that's been part of, corporate compliance for a really long time. I can't really see that going away. But let me ask you, like, where do you see if there's got to be some area for monitoring, certainly. And so where do you, where, as an advocate against sort of overdoing it, where do you see that line? And I'm just trying to think through, like, where can I think about maybe refining this? So I'm taking into all this account. So I'm returning your question around, sorry.
Sure. So a couple of things. First, I always think you need to have a specific purpose and specific mechanisms that only fulfill the function of that purpose.
Okay.
So these giant data grabs. The other thing is, my way or the highway needs to die the painful death that it should have died a long time ago. It's how you end up standing in a silo with a whole group of similarly looking people looking around going, oh, you don't like this? So that approach needs to be rejected completely.
Okay.
In my opinion, it's how we end up with these silos, and we know it. We know exactly, right? The building we look in, it's like, hey, khaki pants and polo shirts. And that's not good or bad. And I don't mean, but it is a lesson that people pick up very quickly. And that signaling and that behavioral reinforcement that occurs from khakis and a polo shirt is so pronounced in our building as we move along, that it's just an easy example of how. So this weekend, I think it was this weekend, there was education surveillance is one of the things we do. We talk about a lot. And one of the young people said, well, I figured out a long time ago, if I logged in the morning, it was a behavioral check-in. If I log in the morning and say I'm excited for the day, that response, even if it occurs every day, prevents me from having to do any follow-up questions. So this kid could be having the world's worst day, and he's picked up that if I push this button, I don't get any more questions or anything. And so, the system has to be monitored to be sure people are not changing their behavior or their responses, because we end up with silos of individuals who walk around, gaming this system. And unfortunately, people are really good at that.
Yeah.
I think it's a natural tendency. So yeah, I guess my biggest thing is have a purpose. So I'm one of the people who's even not necessarily against facial recognition, which will freak people out. It's the overgeneralized misuse of data that is then again overgeneralized and therefore problematic that I have a problem with. So you create a very specific goal, you gather only what's needed to resolve that goal, and then you stop data gathering. You don't just keep creeping all over the place and pick up things about their kids and, well, my kid goes to the same high school as your kid, and therefore we might be sitting in the stands at a soccer game. That's terrifying to me. And so that's, and that's the problem with networks.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I appreciate that. And I appreciate that those are three very specific things that I can draw from. I mean, what has given me, and I've written this in other context, given me some comfort with, I'll use nudging, but behavioral science more generally, is the studies that I have seen indicate that, for example, nudging can be just as effective when it's transparent and open.
Right.
So it doesn't have to be hidden, even though that's how people often think about it.
Right.
So, we can, and people in fact will often opt in to sort of self-nudging. And so that I think gives some indication that that's a positive, and it can be done in a transparent way. So that's one thing maybe to add to your list too, is the transparency and the kind of like opting in, so long as you're right that the penalties for opting out aren't so onerous that it changes behavior that way. So that's, thanks, Angie, that's really helpful.
Absolutely. And I'm happy there's several people on this call that I'm sure would be happy to follow up. And I certainly don't mean, to do my usual add 37 pages to this.
No.
I think a footnote nod and saying, in another day, in another lifetime, this is the next paper, if that's what you're so inclined. But we are officially out of time. So there's awesome discussion. Scott, did you have any final thoughts before we, of course, thank Todd? I loved reading this paper, Todd. I am genuine about that. Thank you for sharing it with us and letting us chat about it. Scott,
Thanks.
do you have any?
Great. Appreciate the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, how about a round of applause? Well done. Thank you for moderating, Angie. Wonderful job, Todd. And just remember our research roundtable summaries this Wednesday at noon. Hope to see you guys there. And thanks so much again for participating. Enjoy the day, everybody. Thanks a lot.